Okay, welcome everybody. Before we begin, just a few housekeeping matters. So if we could go to that slide. Just to remind you to please close other running applications or programs to help maintain a stable connection. The following presentation is intended for educational purposes only. Scenarios are fictitious. The information presented is not intended to provide legal advice. As well, to ask questions during the webinar, please type questions in the box on your screen. Siobhan Cordell, Manager of Investigations and Hearings for the college, will monitor the questions. We will send out FAQs or individual responses for any unanswered questions. Okay. Also, the e-forum recording and slides will be posted on the events section of the CASLPO website. Just press on events and then on e-forums as you see on the screen. I am Brian O'Riordan, Registrar of CASLPO, and my co-presenter today is Priya Singh, the Director of Professional Conduct and General Legal Counsel for the college. Before we begin, I want to say how much we all appreciate those of you that have contacted us about issues relating to racism, systemic and individual discrimination, and the importance that you attach to individual professionals, associations, and regulatory colleges and government showing leadership and facilitating change and awareness. I am pleased to say that CASLPO was the first health college to put out a statement on anti-racism and diversity. And we are the first to present an e-forum on this subject for registrants. I state this not to pat ourselves on the back, but to indicate that we are seized as a college, that we must show leadership in collaboration with you, other stakeholders, and other colleges. And we know that words are not enough. The important thing is to take action going forward, to raise awareness and promote change. And now, just a brief review of the agenda, which we developed as a place to start within the context of the Black Lives Matter movement, Indigenous action groups, and the broader provincial, national, and global conversations and initiatives about diversity, discrimination, and inclusion. We will first talk about CASLPO's mandate in terms of what we can do. We will talk about the activities that we are currently undertaking. We'll then review healthcare and marginalized communities. Then we'll have an overview of some important bylaws, regulations, and guides, including bylaw number 7, the Code of Ethics of the College, culturally appropriate intervention. We have a standard on that. And we also have a guide for service delivery across diverse cultures. Then we will look at 3 practice scenarios. And finally, we'll look at next steps and moving forward. I want to begin with a land acknowledgement. Yes, we understand, of course, we are in the virtual zone, as most of us are these days in terms of doing our work. But the CASLPO office is located in Toronto. And so therefore, we will be using the land acknowledgement for Toronto. We acknowledge the land we are meeting on is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. So let us review the CASLPO mandate. Our activities are limited to the mandate of the college, which is set out in the Regulated Health Professions Act. Very simply, it says the college has a duty to serve and protect the public interest. This is accomplished through meeting the objects of the college, which include regulating the professions in accordance with the governing legislation, regulations, and bylaws, our programs for registration, our programs for quality of practice, and the development and maintenance of ethical professional standards. This is how we fulfill our mandate of protecting the public. CASLPO works to protect the public through these regulatory objectives. The college does not have the authority to directly advocate for patient access to services. We can't do this with government or publicly funded bodies or social service agencies. That is the role of our professional associations, such as OSLA and SIC. CASLPO protects the public by regulating and guiding you, our registrants. Now let us review some of CASLPO's current activities in this area. These include training for council, committees, and staff on areas such as conflict of interest, bias, both conscious and unconscious, specific training relating to diversity and sexual abuse, and other matters as they arise. Council of the college is continually developing competencies to ensure that all members of the council, whether they be members of the professions or of the public, or come from the area of academia, have and possess appropriate experience and knowledge, including matters relating to diversity and inclusion. Also, our approach to equity in hiring staff for the college is reflected in our job advertisements, such as the one that you see on the screen. We strive to build a team that reflects the diversity of the community we work in and encourage applications from traditionally underrepresented groups such as women, visible minorities, Indigenous peoples, people identifying as LGBTQ2SI, veterans, and people with disabilities. If we can make this easier through accommodation in the recruitment process, please contact us. Currently, about 1/3 of our staff, I would note, are from visible minority communities. We also have, as you know, a diversity and inclusion page on our website, and that includes the statement that we made back in June on anti-racism and the provision of ethical care. I will just read a little bit from that statement, which you can see on the screen. The college acknowledges the existence of discrimination, including systemic racism in the province of Ontario, and that it must be addressed by government and all of us working together. The importance of this acknowledgement and recognition has been highlighted in recent weeks by the Black Lives Matter movement in the United States and globally. It is therefore crucial for us to recognize the need to maintain focus on this important issue to enable us to do our part and contribute to making change happen. There are also some very important additional resources included on the page, and we shall continue to add to those resources as we move forward. Let us now look at healthcare in terms of marginalized communities, the impacts and implications for those marginalized communities. When we look at Ontario, we are, of course, a very diverse province in terms of several factors, including languages, as you can see, and also religious beliefs and racial and ethnic identity. This is something I think that we're all very proud of. But studies have shown that patients and communities that have been marginalized for one reason or another are also underserviced within the healthcare environment. Causes can include discrimination and lack of health provider cultural sensitivity and competence, unequal access to services, fear of health providers and institutions, such as Children's Aid, the police, hospitals, daycares, long-term care homes, and of course, other environments. We can also see that marginalized communities experience bias, both personal and systemic. The resulting harm that this can have on individuals is shown in the research. The research shows that there is a negative impact of discrimination, of being discriminated against, in terms of mental and physical health, in terms of increased stress and anxiety, in terms of economic impact, including increased likelihood of poverty, social isolation, and a resulting distrust and subsequent, sometimes aversion to institutional and professional healthcare. This means that when patients feel discriminated against or marginalized, they may not allow their children to be assessed by a school board SLP, for instance. They may not accept the assessment results as fair or unbiased. They may not want to have their parents' hearing tested by an audiologist. They may not want to respond to or follow up on referrals from healthcare providers. The consensus of all this research is that healthcare providers need to become more aware and knowledgeable about their patients and adjust their practices, attitudes, and approaches accordingly. I'm now going to pause at this point to see if there are any questions that any of you have been sending in that we perhaps could address at this point. So Siobhan, is there any questions for Priya or myself?
Yes, Brian, we do have two questions. So the first question is, how can we affect change in our workplaces as SLPs and audiologists? As a person of color, I am bearing the posture of having to speak up. My administrator said anything against racism and has not provided any training despite repeated requests. Can CASLPO help me in my workplace?
Okay, I think that I'll ask Priya to comment as well. This is the kind of dialogue we have to encourage. We have practice advisors available all the time that can speak to any of our registrants about matters such as this. And that is one of the things we will talk about a bit later. But no one should be experiencing the trauma of being discriminated against in their own workplace. So that is something certainly that we can work on, that we will talk to you about. I think we have to begin the discussion on these things in a much more forthright manner. Priya, I'll ask you to comment too, if you'd like.
Sure, thank you, Brian. Unfortunately, I didn't hear the entire question because of a little bit of, I guess, transference in the communication. But if I understand it correctly, the registrant has indicated that they have experienced barriers in terms of affecting change in their workplace, particularly in terms of anti-discrimination and anti-racism. And in those circumstances, consistent with what Brian has advised, it's, I believe, very context specific. And so speaking to a practice advisor or contacting the college for additional advice and resources may be important and incredibly useful. However, there are also obligations from the employer's perspective in terms of the work environment that they are legally required to create for you. So an environment that is free from harassment or discrimination is an obligation under the Occupational Health and Safety Act. So depending on how this behavior is manifesting, whether it be directed at you, patients, or both, there may be a number of avenues that you can contact and utilize to help promote this message. But as I said, I would encourage you to contact us directly so that we can address your question in a more fulsome way.
Thank you, Priya. Siobhan, I think you said there was another question as well that has arisen.
Yes, thank you, there is. This question states, one of the challenges to service equity is the limited availability of publicly funded services for private practice. It goes on to say, data shows that individuals from marginalized communities are more likely to work low-income jobs or hold temporary contracts. And these factors, in combination with others, amplify inequity in service delivery. So the question is, what steps is the college taking to protect the public from service inequity at the systems level?
I think that we always have questions in this area, and some of them we can tackle in collaboration with the associations. The associations will choose to take the lead on. I think the important thing is to surface these issues. I think that we always say to all of you as registrants that you have a duty to advocate for your patients, for individual patients, and for making sure that there is an equitable provision of services to them. Again, it is an area that is not always something the college can move on in terms of taking the lead, but certainly these are issues that we always are having discussions with the professional associations on, and when we can collaborate with them on it, we certainly do, and provide support in ways that we can figure out to do so. But it is more in their wheelhouse. I have to be very, I think, direct with you on, but it is not something that we cannot at least discuss with our professional association counterparts. Priya, I don't know if you want to add to that?
No, Brian, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Siobhan. I think we'll now move to the next section. Please keep the questions coming in, and as I say, if we're not able to address all questions today in the course of the webinar, we will certainly do so afterwards in terms of FAQs. So I'm now going to turn it over to Priya to take us through the next section of the presentation. Priya?
Great, thank you very much, Brian. So my goal today is to review certain key college documents that can help in the provision of care with diverse Ontarians. The first document I want to look at today is the college's Bylaw number 7, which is the Code of Ethics for members of the college. Now, I should note that the Code of Ethics has a number of principles that are applicable to different and diverse areas of your practice. However, there are particular principles and articles that I want to draw your attention to, as they may help and inform your decisions as you go forward. The first principle is Principle 2. In the pursuit of patient benefit, registrants have an ethical obligation to respect patients as persons. And in respecting patients as person, the key is to understand and remember that each patient comes with their own unique experiences, perspectives, and value system, and that's important in the provision of care that they receive. There are also legal standards governing practice, including Article 411, which requires that all registrants abide by the laws of Ontario and Canada. Now, this is a quite broad provision, and it can include a variety of provincial and federal pieces of legislation. However, for the purposes of this topic, key pieces include the Human Rights Code, Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act, as well as the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Now, not every piece of legislation will be relevant to your interactions with every patient, and it's important for you to determine what is applicable for those interactions. Obviously, 417 also requires that all registrants do not discriminate in their relationships with either their patients or their colleagues on the basis of any of the prohibited grounds listed in the Ontario Human Rights Code. Now, before you should see a chart outlining all the protected grounds that are enumerated in the code. And you'll see it's quite broad, spanning from a variety of areas. I think traditionally, many people have understood human rights in terms of race, ancestry, or color, and human rights have been captioned with anti-racism. However, as you can see from the enumerated grounds, a number of protected statuses within Ontario should be respected and should be adhered to when providing care to patients. Article 242 of the professional standards governing the practice also require that registrants practice within the limits of their competencies as determined by their education, their training, and their professional experience. And this is applicable when you have a patient before you who may present with certain factors, experiences, or even dispositions that are outside your realm or your experience level. If it is someone from a different community or someone from a different religion that you do not have experience treating, then it is incumbent upon you to undertake training and ensure that you can provide appropriate care that meets the needs of that particular patient. There may be some cases with some patients where it's more appropriate to refer. This is a very similar provision in terms of a patient who possesses a particular condition that you do not have experience treating. Article 4.2.11 also requires that registrants protect the health and the well-being of their patients and advocate for them where appropriate. And I think this speaks to the earlier question that we had in terms of when you work for particularly an organization or even perhaps a small clinic where there are certain policies and procedures in place that may adversely affect a patient or even a patient population or group. For instance, if you work for a clinic that only provides hearing assessments on one particular day of the week, and this conflicts with religious observance of a particular group, it would be incumbent upon you to speak to your employers to advocate for that change. And as Brian and I indicated earlier, we at the college are happy to provide assistance and guidance in terms of how effective change can be made. I'm now going to take you through the culturally appropriate intervention standard, which states that registrants must make reasonable efforts to ensure that they are responsive to the sociocultural efforts of all phases of intervention. Now, this means that registrants must be aware of what those sociocultural factors are and how they may affect intervention. Now, referring back to the Human Rights Code, those factors can include age, they can include race, they can include marital status. And I want to also emphasize the fact that it may affect intervention. Simply because a patient presents before you with certain factors, either that are visible or you obtain during your conversations with them, does not necessarily mean that you have to affect or change your intervention. Your protocols and procedures may still meet their needs, but in being cognizant of those factors, it's incumbent upon you to take that moment to determine whether you should be affecting and changing your protocols. And therefore, audiologists and speech-language pathologists must incorporate this knowledge into the patient's intervention. And do not make those assumptions about a patient, no matter how they may appear or sound. It's important to remember that each patient is unique. I'm going to turn now to the Guide for Service Delivery Across Diverse Cultures. Now, when looking at this guide and practicing in a diverse Ontario, it's important to remember certain definitions, including diversity, which can be defined as an instance of being composed of differing elements or qualities. It can also be defined as the inclusion of different types of people, such as people of different races or cultures, in a group or organization. Inclusion can be defined as the act or practice of including and accommodating people who have historically been excluded because of their race, their gender, their sexuality, or their ability. And I want to encourage you, when you are reviewing any CASLPO document and you're faced with a patient, remember these definitions when you are providing care. The overview from the guide talks about quality of care and notes that it is provided when practitioners are receptive, but also when they're responsive to the unique needs of the patients. Registrants are required to determine how elements of diversity and individual identity have an impact on intervention. So for instance, I identify as a woman. but being a woman is not my entire identity. There are a number of factors that create my own individual identity, and that may or may not affect your ultimate intervention. Intervention and treatment must therefore always be patient-centered. From the guide, we emphasize that every individual patient is all of the following: like no other, like some others, and like all others. Everyone must understand and respect diversity. These principles apply to all patients, regardless of your perceptions about how similar or dissimilar they may be to you. This is essentially two sides of the same coin. So for instance, you cannot make assumptions about a patient because they sound different, or they look different, or they behave differently from you. But you also cannot make assumptions about that patient if they were to look like you, or sound like you, or behave similarly to you. Understanding perspectives begins with ourselves, and it begins from the point of learning about different perspectives, noting that it is a lifelong process. Knowledge is fluid and ever-flowing, and it's important to have these discussions. It's important to have self-reflection, and it's important to continue to learn. What you may have learned 5 or 10 years ago, even in your professional technical practice, may not be appropriate or may not be current knowledge for today. Understanding diversity in Ontario is no different. Your own identity, history, and culture affect all interactions, creating both conscious and unconscious perceptions. Strategies to address conscious and unconscious beliefs include inviting the patients to share their perspectives and to listen. One of the most common complaints and concerns we hear at the college from patients are that they don't feel as though their practitioner is really listening to them, is really hearing them. They feel as though there are foregone conclusions or assumptions about who they are and what care is appropriate for them. Therefore, it's important to avoid making those assumptions. And when you see reactions that are unexpected, consider the patient's circumstances. So for instance, if you are continually seeing a patient who avoids eye contact with you when interacting, that may be a result of a learned behavior, perhaps from a family or a cultural or religious background, but it may also be that the person presents on the autism spectrum disorder, or that they have an additional condition that may affect their ability to interact with you. Consider different communication styles, such as modifying your interview styles between direct and open-ended questions. Intervention includes determining how to modify your style to meet the patient's needs. Beware of the fact that there may be biases in certain protocols. Studies and data has shown that certain protocols and assessments are grounded from patients who have provided data from North American norms and expectations. So these protocols and assessments may not accurately reflect the condition of your patient, because that patient may not ultimately share the same norms and beliefs as those studied patients in those protocols. Pay attention to behavior and social protocols as cues. It's important to be connected with your patient to understand what they need, and stay flexible in your approach. As I indicated earlier, an example can include avoiding scheduled appointments on religious holidays. And if you're unsure, it is reasonable to ask, but as always, ensure that you are doing so in a professional and respectful way. Develop assessment protocols using a combination of methods and sources. If you are concerned that an assessment tool or protocol may not be appropriate for your patient, read up on the matter, speak to colleagues, and determine how you can make those changes to meet the needs of your patient. Culture and experience can play a role in decision-making, including consent. As Brian indicated and reviewed earlier, certain communities that have been traditionally marginalized may come to you with an already embedded fear of healthcare professionals. And so the concept of providing consent from that place can be very difficult. And sometimes it has nothing to do with something that may have even happened recently from a recent care provider. It could be something that happened to a family member or a friend. And it is your responsibility and obligation to make sure that you are providing the appropriate avenues to inform that patient and ensure that they can consent appropriately. Use appropriate goals that relate to the patient's experience. So for instance, a personal experience that I had is a physician who had indicated to me that I was required to eat meat in order to increase my iron levels. When I explained to her I did not do so because of ethical and religious reasons, she simply insisted that I needed to consume meat. What this is an example of, from my perspective as a patient, is that the goal that was targeted to me was not appropriate for who I was as a person. It also emphasizes the next point that you need to collaborate with a patient. Insisting upon a goal or insisting upon a method that does not meet the needs or potentially conflicts with the patient's beliefs is not going to help them ultimately. Registrants are also responsible for using most appropriate methods of interpretation and translation. So in cases where you may need a translator or an interpreter, determine whether there is a need for interpretation before providing intervention. And you can also consider different options, such as a professional interpreter, as opposed to a parent or a patient's family member. But also keep in mind that during your assessments, during your appointments, personal health information may be disclosed. And so you need to ensure that your patient is comfortable either with discussing this personal health information in front of a professional interpreter who would be a stranger, or conversely, a family member who may not know all the details of your patient's personal health. Prepare all interpreters, both professional and informal, as to what is required in the appointment. For instance, if you were performing a swallowing assessment, let the interpreter know what to expect in addition to advising your patient. You may also say to them or ask them to stand in a certain spot in the room, or maybe not react if a certain response is expected, so that they're prepared to assist in the best way possible. Ask for clarification of any cultural or social norms or expectations that the patient may have of you. And also be alert for the patient's verbal and nonverbal communication. Our nonverbal communication makes up a large amount of the messages that we are actually sending to each other, and these are important to be aware of. I want to pause here before we enter the scenarios to ask Siobhan if there are any questions.
Yes, Priya, we do have 3 questions.
Thank you.
So the first is, the Code of Ethics seems to apply more to individual level based discrimination rather than systemic racism. What is CASLPO doing to investigate the possibility of systemic racism in audiology and SLP services in Ontario?
So it would depend upon the circumstances, because as Brian reviewed earlier, our mandate and our legislation relates specifically to the conduct of registrants, so audiologists and speech language pathologists in practice. If, however, there was an organization, for instance, that created a process or procedure that manifestly created a systemic racism response, then that would be something that we would address. I have to say, I don't know of any case off the top of my head where that has actually occurred, but that would be an instance in which it would then fall under our jurisdiction. In terms of broader systemic racism, our goal today is to help provide information in terms of how you, our registrants, can also combat systemic racism that you see in your practices.
Thank you. Our next question is, does CASLPO collect data regarding the diversity of its registrants? What steps does CASLPO take to support and encourage applicants from marginalized groups to ensure that its registrants are representative of Ontario?
Unfortunately, I do not have the registration data in front of me. I can look into that matter further and get back to that particular individual. I do apologize for not having that information at this time.
Thank you. Okay, and the last question is, there are clinicians who have extensive clinical and personal experience or additional training in particular areas surrounding cultural competence. How can CASLPO help the public connect with these clinicians who have specific cultural competence if they would prefer working with someone who has these qualifications?
It is a difficult position for the college to recommend particular registrants, but it is an interesting idea in terms of specific qualifications. As I'm sure many of you know, our public register includes filtering systems that also allow the public and potential patients to filter through different languages in which our registrants speak to. At this point, again, I do not have that data collected to determine whether it is a recommendation that the college could reasonably make, because we do have the obligation to ensure that we are not recommending one registrant over another. I'm not sure if you have any other comments, Brian.
Yes, I think that's probably the case right now, but it is a very interesting suggestion, certainly. And I think the important thing about that suggestion and some other questions that are being asked is I think it's showing that people are thinking outside the box. And I think when it comes to this area, we have to do that. So I don't think we can rule anything off the table now, because a lot hasn't been done that needs to be done. Sorting out what's the most appropriate tactic to use for an individual college or for another organization or association is what these conversations and dialogues have to be about. So thank you for the question. Okay.
I believe there are no other,
Yep, go ahead.
I believe there are no other questions at this point, so I'm going to move on to the scenarios. Our first scenario looks at a situation where a child from a local Indigenous community is referred to a school board SLP to determine if there is a speech and language delay. How should the SLP approach the assessment? The answer being that the SLP should adapt assessments to consider all relevant factors. It's important to remember that not all assessment protocols may fit. I also want to remind our registrants that our SAT indicators also require under 2.4 that I use intervention procedures that are responsive to the cultural and linguistic backgrounds of our patients as well as substitute decision makers. As well, 4.2 requires that registrants communicate in a manner that is responsive to the cultural and linguistic background of the patient. Now for the assessment, this registrant should consider the following: combining the assessment methods to focus on the child's needs. Remember and recall that standardized assessments may be limited or biased. Examine standardized and non-standardized questions to ensure that they are relevant, necessary, and appropriate. Adapt materials to reflect the child's perspective. Meaningful activities, food, music, important persons or historical figures are all important factors and examples to consider from that child's perspective. Collaborate with the patient and the family for the assessment process. Consider intercultural communication styles may be different from your own, such as body language, eye contact, and touch. Touch can be a key sensitive area for certain individuals. Cultural and religious beliefs, worldview, and social protocols of the child should also be taken into consideration, and show flexibility in scheduling, respecting the child's diverse needs. Further things to consider include style of interviewing during the assessment. So again, recall open versus closed-ended questions. Consider how culture and lived experiences play a role in the child or the SDM's decision-making, including providing consent. Reach out to people who are knowledgeable about the language, culture, and community of the child. And always engage in your own self-learning. The second scenario looks at an audiologist who works in a hospital who makes derogatory comments to an audiologist colleague about, quote, new Canadians being a drain on healthcare funding. How should the audiologist colleague respond? The answer is, first and foremost, to remind your colleague of their professional obligations. Such biases and opinions are unacceptable in the healthcare environment. Recall from the Code of Ethics that registrants are required to not discriminate in their relationships with either their patients or their colleagues on the basis of any of the prohibited grounds listed in the Ontario Human Rights Code. In this example, prohibited grounds that would have been violated includes place of origin, ancestry, race, religion, and citizenship. Also recall from the Guide for Service Delivery Across Diverse Cultures that registrants should be reviewing their own organizational values, policies, practices, and procedures, and if necessary, advocate for change to ensure inclusivity. Communication with colleagues, patients and their families, and communities should be based on cultural knowledge, human dignity, respect, and egalitarian reciprocity. Engage in tools and resources that become more so that you can become more informed about culture. Before I move on to the third scenario, I want to pause again to ask Siobhan if there are any questions.
Yes, there were, Priya. Thank you. So the first question is, what does CASLPO suggest we do if we have a patient, if there was a patient having a discriminatory attitude towards the therapist, which may affect the provision of care?
So in circumstances where you may have a patient who is exhibiting discriminatory behavior or potentially behaving in a way that is unsafe, you as an employee also have the right to work in a location free of harassment. Under the Occupational Health and Safety Act, your employer has an obligation to ensure that they have policies and procedures in place to prevent or at least to minimize and stop that type of behavior. Because as it is unacceptable for that type of behavior to be directed at a patient, it's also unacceptable for that type of behavior to be directed at a practitioner. In that circumstance, the most appropriate step may be to address the concerns with the particular patient, but it also may be to discharge the patient as well. Again, it does depend on the circumstances of the case. And if you are faced with such a situation, we encourage you to contact the college.
Thank you. Okay, our next question is, who would you ask for clarification of social or cultural norms? Would it be the patient, their interpreter, or someone else? And they're asking if you can provide an example.
I would say all of the above, really. There's, because it's such a wide topic, because it's such a wide breadth of information, it would depend on the patient that you are seeing. But I would suggest the first step that you take every time is to do some self-learning first and foremost. Look at resources, check journals and articles, even look for subject matter experts who might be willing to have conversations with you to walk you through concerns that you may have. Also, again, reach out to colleagues to see if anyone else has experiences. Sometimes you might not have a colleague who has an experience, but between the two of you, or maybe a group of you, you can determine how to best approach the patient. And then I would suggest also approaching the patient to ensure that you have understood their concerns appropriately and that you can best treat them for their particular circumstances.
Anything else, Siobhan?
Yes, we do have one last question.
Okay.
Can CASLPO provide data about the number of complaints received that are grounded in issues of racism or other type of discrimination? It would be helpful to know the type of complaints received and the percentage that they represent within the total amount of complaints received.
Generally speaking, the Inquiries, Complaints, and Reports Committee, who is the committee who deals with complaints and investigations that would fall under this nature, report the statistics to council on a quarterly basis. I believe it was approximately 2 years ago, we started collecting specific qualitative data in these circumstances and have been reporting that to council as well. All of the council material is available on our website and is posted approximately a week before council meetings. It also remains on our website, so I would encourage you to take a look at those resources. I can say from my personal experience with the college, the frequency of complaints along the lines of discrimination and racism is quite low. However, the college has received complaints of that nature. Siobhan, was that the last question?
Yes, it is. Thank you.
Yeah, I would just add, and thank you again for the question, very good question. We know, I think, from other jurisdictions and from other organizations that one of the things that we really need to address more broadly is the fact that often discriminatory behavior, discriminatory comments may be underreported. They may be underreported in the healthcare sector. They may be underreported in schools or other environments as well. And some of that is because of the power imbalance that occurs in these institutions. And some of it is because these are very uncomfortable conversations and some that can lead to confrontations. What we have to do, I think, is to make it more acceptable for people to fight back against this kind of discrimination, not to tolerate it. And I think that as people become more comfortable in reporting these things and understanding the damage that they do to the whole fabric of society, I think that we'll see some more people perhaps coming forward. But I think that it's quite true from our perspective right now. We do not have a lot of cases, but we have had some, even though we are a small college. And we also know from the experiences of many other colleges that unfortunately they are experiencing an uptick, and we may as well in terms of complaints in this area. So while we haven't experienced a lot, just as we haven't experienced a lot of sexual abuse complaints either, these are still things you have to be prepared for. These are still things that are out there, and these are still things that are going to need to be addressed. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Brian. I'm going to move to one more scenario, and we will have an opportunity for questions again in case this scenario causes any queries, or in case you're still pondering questions from material that we presented earlier in this presentation. So our third scenario looks at an audiologist in private practice who is approached by a couple that identify as same-sex, who are seeking a hearing assessment for their child. The audiologist holds religious beliefs against same-sex couples. What should the audiologist do? The answer, quite simply, is the audiologist is expected to provide service to the patient and the family. Recall again from the Code of Ethics, Principle 1, where the primary obligation of the audiologist and the speech-language pathologist is to practice their skills to the benefit of their patients. Principle 2, again, requires that in the pursuit of patient benefit, audiologists and speech-language pathologists have an ethical obligation to respect patients as persons. Again, from the Code of Ethics, Article 417 requires that audiologists and speech-language pathologists not discriminate in their relationships with either their patients or their colleagues on the basis of any prohibited grounds listed in the Ontario Human Rights Code. For this example, protected grounds that may have been violated include sexual orientation, family status, and marital status. I want to also highlight that the Human Rights Code applies to protected social areas of goods, services, and facilities. And so in this circumstance, the private audiology clinic would be a protected ground. I also want to emphasize that in some circumstances, a registrant may feel that it's more appropriate to refer the patient because they feel that they are incapable of providing care. However, if the college becomes aware of a pattern of referrals based on a particular group of people, this is demonstrative of discriminatory behavior and is subject to professional misconduct. Now, I want to take one more opportunity to pause for some questions before Brian concludes our presentation.
Thank you, Priya. So there are a few questions at this time. So the first is, are there plans for CASLPO to provide more education about specific populations that registrants work with?
I believe Brian will be talking about that in our next steps. So if you can hold on to that question just for a little bit, we'll get to that. And if it doesn't answer the question, feel free to contact us directly and we can explore that topic further. Vaughn?
Thank you. The next question is a bit related, but it's, are CASLPO documents available in multiple languages so that minority client groups know their rights and the processes for complaints?
Yeah, yes, maybe I can maybe address that, Priya, but yes, we are endeavoring to do more of that. We do have some of our brochures are definitely available in about 10 different languages right now. But it is an area that we're always looking at to try to make sure that we are addressing the cultural diversity of the province and specific communities. I think as we move forward, we want to do more of this. And I think that it's also important to note that with respect to Indigenous languages, we have a special project right now that is focused on providing translation from English to some of the Indigenous languages as well. But thank you for raising that question because, again, it is something that I think all organizations have to be more sensitive to and more responsive to. And sorry, Priya, I know you had something else as well. Sorry about that.
No, not at all. You said exactly what I was going to say.
Oh, okay. Great minds think alike. Okay. I think as we're moving forward, I should probably go into the final slides as we're getting close to our adjournment time. So I am going to talk about next steps and moving forward. So first of all, I want to again say that CASLPO is committed to keeping this conversation going and will continue to add resources to our diversity and inclusion page. Education and training for council members, for committee members, and for our staff will not only address anti-racism and anti-discrimination, but will also focus on positive changes towards greater diversity and inclusivity. Bylaw number 7, the Code of Ethics, has served us well, but it will now, I think, be appropriate that it undergo some review and possibly amendments. And we shall do this, of course, in consultation with registrants, stakeholders, and the public. Similarly, the Guide for Service Delivery Across Diverse Cultures, which was published in 2016, I think has a lot in it, as Priya showed you today, to assist registrants in the delivery of service. But in the current context, again, we think it's timely to review it and perhaps update it. And again, that will involve a broad consultation with registrants and stakeholders and the public. Moving forward as well, I will also want to talk to you, go to the next slide. I guess we can go to the next slide at this point. CASLPO will create more learning opportunities about anti-racism, anti-discrimination, diversity, and inclusion. For example, e-forums, surveys, and FAQs. So I thank again the questioner who brought that forward. Certainly, we do see a role for the college in providing more education and more guidance in this whole area. And how we develop these will be informed, I think, by some of the surveys that we do. I think it will be informed by our collaboration with other colleges and other organizations as we move forward. So we will welcome suggestions from the public and from you, our registrants, particularly in this regard. Tell us what you need. Tell us what you hope that we can provide, and that will be very helpful. We will collaborate with other health colleges to develop further resources and initiatives, not only in education, but perhaps in other areas as well. And we'll be doing this through the new province-wide working group amongst all of the colleges, a working group on anti-racism, of which I am a member. I don't think we have time perhaps for further questions right now, but I did want to recommend to you some of the resources that we have listed here. Some of them relate to some of the topics that we have in fact addressed today. And I think that all of them can be very helpful to you as you encounter any difficulties in the workplace, as you have those important conversations with patients and with colleagues. So it remains for me to say that we want to offer to all of you a very big thank you for your participation in this today, and for many of your excellent questions. And of course, we didn't get to all of them, but we will be addressing those as we go forward. I think it's very, very important that we keep the conversation going. We have many ways that we can connect with you and that you can connect with us. I think the most important thing is to keep this movement for equity, fairness, and justice going forward. I think all of us can contribute to that in very fulsome ways. I think all of us have a role to play. I think all of us have a story we can tell. I think all of us have experienced things that we never thought we would experience and have never thought that we should experience. And whether it's a patient or a provider, whether it's an employer or an employee, we all have a stake in moving forward in a more positive, more open, and more inclusive and more sensitive way. And that is going to make a difference. So thank you again to all of you out there. Thank you very much to my co-presenter, Priya, for I hope what you found was a very enlightening presentation. And thank you to Siobhan for handling the questions today, and for many of the other CASLPO staff that were involved. So thank you. Let's keep the dialogue going. Let's keep an open mind on all of this, and let's make sure that we make a difference. Thank you.
Thank you.